The warning did not come from a missile launch, a naval interception, or a breaking news banner. It came from a sentence. This week, while warplanes were still flying, while negotiators were still moving between capitals, and while the Strait of Hormuz remained the most dangerous strip of water on Earth, China's defense minister stood up and said Chinese ships were moving through Hormuz and would keep moving through Hormuz. That was the moment. Not because the language was theatrical. It was not. Beijing almost never uses theatrical language unless it has already decided the signal matters. What made the moment extraordinary was the setting around it. The United States was in the middle of an active military campaign against Iran. The strait was under intense global scrutiny. War risk insurance had driven much of international shipping away. Western carriers were treating the waterway like a live minefield. And right there, in the middle of that, Beijing calmly said its ships were still crossing. That is the scene you need to hold in your head, not a conference room, not a policy paper. A narrow strip of water, tense, armed, overexposed, and dangerous, with much of the world backing away from it while China publicly announces that its own vessels are still going through. The real story is not that China warned Trump. The real story is that China just turned Hormuz into a collision ladder for the United States. That is what matters here. Because once Chinese ships keep moving through that strait under a public guarantee from Beijing, every American move becomes more dangerous. Every option climbs the ladder, every step raises the price, and the deeper reason this matters is not only China's words, it is the structure underneath the words. China is not talking like a tourist in the Gulf. China is talking like a power whose energy system, industrial rhythm, and geopolitical credibility are physically tied to that waterway. If Washington tries to squeeze Iran in a way that touches those Chinese interests directly, this stops being a clean US-Iran pressure campaign and starts becoming something much larger. That is why this moment is so much more important than it looks. When Admiral Dong Jun said Chinese ships were moving in and out of the Strait of Hormuz without disruption and that Beijing would honor its trade and energy commitments with Iran, that was not ordinary diplomatic housekeeping. It was a declaration of continued presence. And when he warned outside powers not to interfere in China's bilateral affairs, that was not a polite footnote. That was the line. Beijing was saying something very specific. Our relationship with Iran is still live. Our ships are still moving. Our energy commitments are still in force. And if you think this war gives you the right to renegotiate that relationship for us, it does not. That is a very different thing from a routine statement of concern. And the reason Beijing chose to say it now is simple. Timing is part of the message. If China had delivered this line before the strikes, it would have sounded theoretical. If China had said it after a settlement, it would have sounded symbolic. Saying it in the middle of an unstable military campaign while ceasefire talks are fragile and intelligence reports are swirling about possible weapons flows to Tehran turns a statement into strategic placement. It puts China inside the scene. Now you can see the first rung of the collision ladder because the United States can pressure Iran. It can threaten Iranian infrastructure. It can sanction Iranian banks. It can strike Iranian targets. What it cannot do easily is pretend that a waterway used by Chinese commercial traffic is now a simple battlefield under American discretion. Chinese shipping changes the geometry. Chinese shipping turns military freedom into political constraint. And this is where the story gets more serious. China is not exposed to Hormuz in some vague geopolitical way. China is exposed to it directly, daily, structurally. China is the world's largest importer of crude oil. It brings in roughly 10 to 12 million barrels every day. A substantial share comes from the Persian Gulf. Saudi crude, Iraqi crude, Emirati crude, Kuwaiti crude, Iranian crude, they all pass through the same maritime gate. Qatar's LNG sits there too. The whole corridor points east. And a huge portion of that eastbound flow ends in China. That means Hormuz is not a distant problem for Beijing. It is an artery. You can build pipelines. You can diversify routes. You can talk about strategic reserves and redundancy. All of that matters. None of it changes the central fact. There is no practical substitute for the volume that moves through that gap. If Hormuz is disrupted, China does not experience a talking point problem. China experiences a systems problem. Refining, manufacturing, electricity generation, industrial confidence, shipping schedules, price stability, the whole chain feels it. So when Beijing says, in effect, do not touch this route, it is not speaking from abstraction, it is speaking from necessity. And that necessity is one reason the China-Iran relationship matters so much more than most Western coverage admits. For years, the West described that relationship as an awkward convenience, cheap oil for China. Diplomatic cover for Iran, some infrastructure promises, some sanctions evasion, a few indirect transfers, some quiet coordination. That description now looks far too small because in a crisis like this, relationships reveal what they really are. Iran cannot sell its crude freely on the open market under this pressure environment. China does not recognize the legitimacy of the sanctions architecture in the same way Washington does. So Beijing became the buyer that matters. Not the only buyer in theory, the buyer that keeps the system breathing in practice. By various estimates, China has been taking roughly 1 to 1.5 million barrels per Dalton Y of Iranian crude, sometimes more, using layers of obscurity that are now well known, even if they remain politically convenient to deny ship transfers, rebranded cargoes, indirect routing, different flags, different paperwork. A barrel leaves Iran with one identity and arrives in Asia with another. Everyone who studies this trade understands the pattern. The paperwork says one thing, the molecules say another. That matters, because when Admiral Dong says China will honor its energy commitments with Iran, he is not promising to protect a decorative side arrangement. He is publicly defending one of the load-bearing beams of China's energy architecture, and that is why his warning sounds calm but lands hard. Now, let me tighten the master axis, because everything else in this story hangs off one question. What happens when American pressure on Iran starts touching Chinese survival interests? That is the whole game. Not what happens when Washington condemns Tehran, not what happens when sanctions are announced in a press room, not what happens when another round of talks opens or collapses in Islamabad. The real question is what happens when an American strategy designed to coerce Iran collides with Chinese shipping, Chinese energy security, Chinese credibility, and possibly Chinese supply routes. That is the collision ladder. And once you see that ladder, you can see why this situation is so dangerous. Option 1 for Washington is to do almost nothing directly to Chinese shipping. That sounds like the low-risk option. Avoid a direct incident. Keep the focus on Iran. Preserve room for diplomacy. Do not create a crisis with Beijing on top of the existing conflict, but that option carries a price. If Chinese vessels keep moving while the waterway remains dangerous for much of everyone else, then the world sees a hierarchy taking shape in real time. Iran threatens, America strikes, Western shipping recoils, China keeps sailing. Beijing looks like the one power that can protect its commercial line through the storm without firing a shot. That is a propaganda victory. It is also a structural signal to every government watching if you want trade continuity under pressure. Maybe the American umbrella is not the only umbrella that matters anymore. That is not a small cost. Option 2 is selective interdiction. Washington could try to identify and stop shipments it believes are tied to sanctions, evasion, or to military replenishment, especially if the intelligence around air defense systems becomes more concrete. On paper, that sounds disciplined, surgical, targeted, reasonable. In practice, this is where the ladder rises fast, because now the United States has to be right about the vessel, right about the cargo, right about the legal basis, right about the intelligence, and right about the timing, all in one of the most sensitive waterways on Earth. If the ship is Chinese flagged, Chinese chartered, Chinese insured, or politically treated by Beijing as a Chinese interest, the problem is no longer technical, it becomes national. China does not have to fire a shot to turn that incident into a full diplomatic rupture. It only has to say America interfered with lawful Chinese commerce in a moment of already elevated US-China tension. That is enough to widen the crisis dramatically. And if Washington stops the wrong ship or stops the right ship but cannot prove its case in a way that persuades allies, it loses twice. It absorbs the escalation and looks reckless at the same time. Option 3 is broader coercion. The United States could try to raise the cost for Beijing outside the strait itself, more sanctions pressure, more secondary sanctions, more threats against firms, refineries, financiers, insurers, or intermediaries handling Iranian-linked cargoes, make the whole network more expensive to run, force China to choose between discounted Iranian supply and wider economic pain. That sounds cleaner than naval confrontation. It is still not clean, because once you push on that network hard enough, you are no longer merely sanctioning Iran. You are openly contesting a major piece of China's external energy model that pushes Beijing toward a public response, not only because of oil, but because of status. Great powers do not like being told that their core trade routes can exist only on another power's permission. If Washington pushes too hard, the message Beijing hears is not stop buying Iranian crude. The message Beijing hears is accept that your industrial system remains vulnerable to decisions made in Washington. That is exactly the dependence China has spent 2 decades trying to escape, and that is why this option also climbs the ladder. Option 4 is military expansion. This is the option everyone says they want to avoid, and the option history shows can arrive anyway when enough smaller moves fail. More patrols, more interdictions, more aggressive enforcement, tighter rules, more strikes, tied to the logic of securing the corridor and degrading Iranian capacity at the source. But the minute that military logic intersects with a Chinese vessel, a Chinese convoy pattern, or a Chinese linked cargo alleged to contain military equipment, the crisis mutates. What began as a coercive campaign against Iran now risks becoming a live test of whether the United States is willing to physically interrupt Chinese movement in one of the most important energy waterways on the planet. That is not just another rung, that is the rung from which strategic accidents happen. And this is why Beijing spoke now, because China does not have to deploy a battle fleet into Hormuz to complicate American planning. It only has to make clear that Chinese movement through the strait carries political backing from the top. That one move alone forces Washington to calculate around China in every serious scenario. Beijing inserted itself into the operating environment with a sentence that is a sophisticated use of power. Now, layer in the intelligence reporting, because this is where the story becomes genuinely alarming, CNN reported, citing people familiar with US intelligence assessments, that China may be preparing to deliver additional air defense systems to Iran, specifically MANPADS, shoulder-fired missiles that can threaten low-flying aircraft. China flatly denied it. That contradiction is normal in conflicts like this. Intelligence points one way, official denial points the other. And what matters is not one headline, but the pattern around it. The pattern here is what gives the report weight. First, there is already a known history of Chinese dual-use technology and components ending up in Iranian systems. Second, Trump himself acknowledged that a U.S. aircraft was brought down by a handheld heat-seeking missile, which matters because shoulder-fired systems are exactly the kind of weapon that are cheap, concealable, and hard to suppress completely from the air. Third, if Iran is using any ceasefire window to replenish and harden its remaining defenses, that is not surprising. It is what any state under bombardment would try to do. So now imagine the logic from Washington's point of view. If the intelligence is right, every day matters. The longer replenishment channel stays open, the more dangerous the operating environment becomes for American pilots. That creates urgency, but urgency pushes Washington up the ladder to stop the replenishment. It may have to touch routes, ships, intermediaries, or cargoes tied to China. And the moment it does that, it is no longer simply managing an Iran file. It is walking directly toward the red line Beijing just drew. This is why the source material of this crisis matters less than the structure of it. People get distracted by whether one specific shipment has been confirmed, whether one official statement was stronger than expected, whether one set of talks in Islamabad is still alive. Those details matter, but the deeper truth sits underneath them. China is trying to create a zone in which it can preserve its energy corridor, support its relationship with Iran, possibly help Iran stay supplied, and still stay below the threshold of direct war with the United States. America is trying to preserve freedom of action against Iran without triggering a direct clash with China. Iran is trying to survive, rearm, negotiate, and exploit every crack between those two larger powers. That is the real triangle. And once you understand that triangle, you understand why this feels so unstable. It is not unstable because one side is irrational. It is unstable because all three sides are rational in ways that collide. China wants access without humiliation. America wants pressure without great power escalation. Iran wants relief without surrender. Those three goals do not fit together cleanly inside a 21-mile gap of water. That is why the ceasefire talks matter, but also why they're not enough by themselves. Yes, negotiations in Islamabad are a real signal that nobody has fully given up on diplomacy. Yes, the fact that both sides are still willing to talk is better than the alternative, but diplomacy does not happen in a vacuum. It happens under the pressure of real movements, real intelligence, real shipping, real military risk, and real domestic politics from Washington's side. The problem is obvious. If Iran is using any pause to restock and harden its position, then waiting can make the military problem worse, but moving too hard can create the China problem instantly. From Tehran's side, the logic is just as clear. The longer Iran can stay in the game without breaking, the more likely outside powers become nervous about escalation and start pushing for accommodation rather than collapse. And from Beijing's side, the optimal position is even more subtle. China wants neither Iranian collapse nor a US-China naval incident. It wants a managed crisis in which its own interests remain protected, its own access remains intact, and Washington learns once again that American force cannot reorganize this region on terms that ignore China. That is what Admiral Dong's statement defended. He was not merely defending current shipping. He was defending a principle. The principle is that China's relationship with Iran is not subject to American wartime editing. And if Washington tries to edit it anyway, every option gets worse. There is a historical pattern here that is worth seeing clearly. Great powers often discover their limits not when they are weak, but when a smaller campaign suddenly reveals a larger constraint. A state thinks it is fighting one adversary, only to discover that the battlefield contains another power, as vital interests embedded inside it. Not always with troops, sometimes with trade, sometimes with finance, sometimes with a diplomatic guarantee that looks soft until somebody tests it. That is where America is now in Hormuz. It is not that the U.S. Navy lacks capacity. It does not. It is not that Washington lacks coercive tools. It does not. The problem is that coercive tools are least clean precisely where Chinese interests are most entangled. The more Washington pushes toward decisive control, the more it risks discovering that the strait is not simply an Iranian problem set. It is an Iranian problem set wrapped around a Chinese energy problem, and China knows that. That is why the tone was calm. Calm signals confidence. Beijing did not need a dramatic speech because the underlying leverage is already there. Chinese demand matters. Chinese shipping matters. Chinese tolerance for interference matters. If your economy drinks from the Gulf every day, you do not have to scream to show seriousness. You only have to remind the world that your ships are still moving while others are not. That is what made the statement sting. Now, let me make the master judgment as plainly as possible. The real story is not that China issued a warning. The real story is that China has turned Hormuz into a place where American pressure on Iran now carries a China surcharge. Every serious move costs more than it used to. Ignore Beijing, and China looks protected while America looks selectively constrained. Interdict Chinese linked flows, and the crisis widens beyond Iran. Escalate the sanctions architecture, and you strike closer to the heart of China's energy model, expand military pressure, and you raise the odds of an accident with a peer power whose ships are still physically present in the corridor. That is the latter. And if you want to understand how dangerous this moment is, do not watch the rhetoric first. Watch whether Washington can find any move that meaningfully tightens pressure on Iran without taking another step up that ladder. That is the real test. Because if no such move exists, then this war has already changed shape. It is no longer just about stopping Iran. It is about whether the United States can still impose order in the world. As most important energy choke point when China has decided that its own interests will keep moving through it anyway. That is why this warning stunned the world, not because it was loud, because it was placed exactly where America's options are weakest. And if this continues, the sentence everyone will remember will not be the warning itself, it will be the truth underneath it in Hormuz. Now, every road to Iran runs through China first,